Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two strange disappearances where the people were found, but that only makes the cases more confusing and incredibly disturbing, because there's nothing quite like finding someone many years after they disappeared, especially if what they went through in that time was horrifying. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. A young man named Devonte disappeared on the afternoon of Sunday, November 14th, 2010. It's unclear where he went or what he did, but a motorist saw a young man matching his description walking along Interstate 85 just north of Charlotte Douglas International Airport at approximately 8:15 that night. The following morning, his family called the Charlotte Police Department and reported him missing when he didn't show up at school. Now this is where things get strange. At about 9:30 on the night of Monday, November 15th, 2010, a group of college students was driving down Briarbrook Street in Milton, Massachusetts. This is nearly 850 miles away from Charlotte, North Carolina, where Devonte was last seen. After rounding a bend, their headlights illuminated an unidentified object lying in the road. They initially thought it was a trash bag or a deer that was recently hit by a car. This is a relatively common sight. Milton was just 10 miles south of downtown Boston, but it was adjacent to a 7,000-acre nature preserve that had a huge deer population. But as they got closer, they realized instead that it was a broken human body wearing only a pair of tattered jeans. They immediately called 911, and officers from the local police department arrived at the scene shortly thereafter. And almost immediately, they couldn't determine what happened or who it was because the body was in such horrific shape. Initially, it looked like whoever it was had been the victim of a violent hit-and-run accident. During the autopsy, though, the medical examiner found a shattered plastic card and a high school pass from October 19th in one of the victim's jean pockets. Unfortunately, neither of these items revealed the young man's identity. The medical examiner also didn't find any knife or gunshot wounds, but the body was riddled with broken bones and severe internal injuries, all of which were consistent with a fall from a significant height. Investigators were baffled by these findings. There was nothing along the street that he could have fallen from that was tall enough to cause such traumatic wounds. Investigators eventually identified him as Devonte Tisdale using fingerprints and the jeans and belt that family members confirmed belonged to him. Everyone was devastated by his death, but they were also baffled because he had no known ties to Boston or Massachusetts, and as far as they knew, he didn't have any enemies either. And at that point, it wasn't even clear how he got there or how he died. Horrifyingly, investigators eventually learned that he was also hit by at least two vehicles before the college students stopped and called 911. But even weirder than that, Devonte was clearly dead when those two incidents occurred. Police also considered that he was attacked or involved in some kind of accident elsewhere and dumped in Milton after the fact. However, they never found any evidence to substantiate either of these theories. It looked like the case was at a standstill until one of the investigators made the wild suggestion that he may have fallen out of an airplane bound for Logan International Airport in Boston. At that point, the authorities couldn't rule anything out, but this didn't seem particularly likely because, as everyone knows, people don't just fall out of airplanes. At least, they don't fall out of pressurized aircraft cabins. On the other hand, stowaways have known to fall out of airplane wheel wells. According to the FAA, nearly 100 people have stowed away or attempted to stow away in the wheel wells of commercial airliners since the 1940s. And interestingly enough, a few residents of Milton told investigators that they heard an alarmingly loud bang the night the body was found. Another detail in support of this theory came from the shattered plastic card that was found in his jeans. When investigators put it back together, they found that it was a digital room key from a hotel near the airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. And again, the medical examiner had ruled that Devonte's injuries were consistent with a fall from a significant height. Since he lived in Charlotte at the time of his death, investigators began checking airline records for flights that departed from Charlotte Douglas International to Logan International on the night in question. Almost immediately, they came across US Airways Flight 1176 that landed at Logan less than an hour before Devonte's body was discovered. And as it turned out, when they checked the Boeing 737 that made the flight between Charlotte and Boston that night, they found Devonte's fingerprints on the landing gear and on the door that closed over the wheel when the aircraft was in flight. By then, investigators didn't need any more supporting evidence, but they also found a red shirt and a pair of shoes in the woods nearby. Devonte's family members confirmed that both these items belonged to him. When these remarkable findings were released, additional investigations were launched by the Charlotte Police Department, the FAA, and the TSA. Before long, the investigations uncovered a number of serious security issues at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport. For starters, less than 4 dozen full-time officers were assigned to the airport. This was surprising because it was one of the 20 busiest airports in the country, and some similar-sized airports had nearly twice as many permanent officers. In addition, much of the security fencing around the airport was old, damaged, and in some cases missing. This was true even around especially sensitive areas like hangars, terminals, maintenance shops, and runways. So in light of these findings, they determined that Devonte crawled through a hole in the fence, made his way to the US Airways 737 that had been sitting on the tarmac for nearly 40 minutes and ultimately climbed up into its wheel well before the airplane took off. It's not entirely clear how the 100-minute flight played out, but there's a good chance that Devonte died of hypothermia shortly after the 737 reached its cruising altitude somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 feet. Unlike passenger cabins, aircraft wheel wells aren't pressurized or heated. At that altitude, the air would have been too thin to breathe, and temperatures could have been as low as -50 degrees Fahrenheit or -45 Celsius. Another possibility is that he was crushed when the landing gear retracted back into the aircraft shortly after takeoff. But whatever the case, it's no wonder that stowaways like Devonte rarely survive even the shortest flights. And of those who do survive the takeoff and climb to cruising altitude, most fall to their deaths when the landing gear is lowered during the final approach to the destination airport. As a result, we'll never know if Devonte was alive or dead when he fell from the Boeing 737 en route to Logan International Airport on the evening of Monday, November 15, 2010. But either way, if the frigid air and landing gear didn't kill him, the impact certainly did. Devonte's death was tragic on a number of levels. By all accounts, he was an exceptional young man with a bright future in the Air Force. Nobody could figure out why he decided to stow away on a commercial airliner bound for a city where he had no known ties. These questions may never be answered, but in the wake of the tragedy, his family filed a lawsuit against the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. It alleged that the city was negligent because it failed to adequately secure Charlotte Douglas International Airport. His family claimed he never should have been able to make it onto airport grounds, let alone into the wheel well of a commercial airliner. However, a judge ultimately dismissed the case on the grounds that the legal standard for negligence wasn't met. And what must have come as a crushing blow to Devonte's loved ones, he also ruled that Devonte was the one who acted negligently. On a cold Monday morning in Vienna, Austria, 10-year-old Natasha walked alone through the Donnerstadt district with her backpack. And that day was kind of an important day. For a while now, she had been lobbying her mother to let her walk to school on her own instead of being dropped off, and all of Natasha's efforts had finally paid off. As Natasha walked though, she didn't really feel like a winner, quite the opposite actually. Her mind was swirling with despair she had carried for a while now, maybe years. For much of her life to that point, her mother and father had taken turns trying to shape her and apparently literally slap her into what they wanted her to be. She also lived in a neighborhood riddled with noise and instability where drunks wandered the streets and rage lived just below the surface in far too many households. At school, she also felt like an outsider, and at home, she felt like a burden. And thanks to all of this, although she might not have given it a name, she was depressed. As she walked towards school on March 2nd, 1998, she entertained a twisted fantasy in her mind. What if she just stepped out into the road? She hadn't made a plan exactly, it was more like a fleeting thought that would come and go, but it was one that had been showing up for a long time now. Things had gotten so bad at home that despite her age, Natasha just couldn't see another way out. As she passed along a quiet stretch of road, something caught her attention. It was a man standing beside a white delivery van. There was nothing overly threatening about him. In fact, he looked pretty harmless. Still, something inside Natasha stirred at the sight of him. It was a vague sense of alarm. She didn't quite understand why he unsettled her so much, but she did her best to shrug it off and kept walking towards school. Then, looking straight ahead, she kept closing the gap between herself and the man, and that's when it happened. A hand suddenly clamped down on her. She screamed, kicked, and thrashed, but it didn't matter. He was too strong. She was then yanked off the street and into the van before anyone had a chance to see anything. Now pinned inside the van, Natasha did the only thing her terrified mind could think of. She started asking questions. How old was he? Did he have any children? What was his shoe size? Despite her age again, she had watched enough crime shows to know that the details mattered and that information might save her life. Maybe if she spoke to him, he wouldn't kill her, but the man didn't answer much. He just drove fast towards some unknown destination. The van drove about 12 miles into a quiet, affluent suburb. The man, whose name was Wolfgang, then parked in the garage of a modest house, and when the garage door shut, he carried Natasha out of the van like she was luggage. Inside the garage, everything looked normal, but the floor concealed a trap door that Wolfgang flung open to reveal a steep staircase that led down into the darkness. At the bottom was what appeared to be a solid concrete wall, unless you knew what you were looking for. Behind a cupboard and a hatch was a narrow passage through the concrete carved out by hand. Just getting into the space took a while, and at the end of the crawl space was a room. It was 54 square feet or 5 square meters of reinforced concrete that could best be described as a makeshift prison cell. There were no windows, no ventilation, nothing connected the cell to the outside world other than the hand-dug tunnel. It was also completely soundproof too. If Natasha screamed down there, it wouldn't matter. No one would ever hear her. This was going to be her new reality. After Wolfgang got Natasha into the cell, he finally spoke more than a few words to her. He said he wanted her school bag, but Natasha insisted on keeping it. No amount of protest was going to change Wolfgang's mind though. He was suspicious of it, paranoid even, paranoid that she might have some kind of transmitter inside it. This made no sense to her, but Natasha didn't really argue any further. She didn't really understand it at the time, but this was the first instance that he revealed that his grip on reality was a little shaky. In the midst of all this insanity, Natasha decided that the best thing for her to do was to be compliant and even sweet. So incredibly, despite the fear and the horrific situation, on that first night she spent inside the concrete cell, she apparently requested that Wolfgang tuck her in, read her a story, and give her a goodnight kiss, all of which he was more than happy to do. For a while afterward, if you can believe it, things seemed manageable in a way. They were twisted and terrifying, but manageable. He bought her expensive pastries and toys like he was trying to act out some warped version of fatherhood or friendship. She in turn tried to make sense of the madness by pretending it wasn't so bad, and in the process she regressed and started acting younger than she was. It was easier to survive that way at first, but didn't stay that way for long. Wolfgang and the gifts soon got weirder. One day it would be a remote control car, the next it was mouthwash and scotch tape. He apparently even one time told her that he was an Egyptian god, and she nodded along, because what else was she supposed to do? This was another instance of his loose grip on reality. For the first 6 months of this, Natasha wasn't allowed out of the cell, not even for a second. Then when he finally started letting her upstairs, always under strict conditions, she was still locked down in the chamber every night and every time he went to work. For a while, this was the routine. She was let out, she was washed, and she was sent back down. Eventually though, things changed. She was seen outside in the garden sometimes by neighbors. One of Wolfgang's business associates even saw her there once and claimed she looked relaxed and happy, at least outwardly. As the months turned into years and she got older, she started pushing back. She stopped playing along with his delusions, and that resistance made him furious. Wolfgang seemed to need control, and when Natasha stopped being the obedient, wide-eyed child she had first been, he seemed to try to crush her. He amped things up hard, and beatings soon became routine. And these weren't just the angry slaps she'd received from her mother, these were calculated, punishing attacks. If she so much as looked at him the wrong way, he'd explode. It was like if she showed any sign of strength, he'd try to crush it. He started depriving her of meals, making her weak on purpose. Sometimes she was so underfed that she could barely stand, let alone run for it if the situation ever presented itself. At one point, as part of these punishments, he installed an intercom system between his bedroom and the cell, and at night he'd lie in bed with the intercom on, yelling insults. His goal was to keep her awake and scared. He wanted her to feel like there was no escape and no peace, not even in sleep. And it wasn't just physical torment either. He would bring her upstairs, make her clean the house only partially clothed, barking orders at her like she was a servant. She also wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to, and if she did, she paid for it. Despite his best efforts though, Wolfgang could never break her. And then at the same time all this was going on, there were moments where Wolfgang would flip. He'd cry, apologize, and bring her gifts. He'd talk about their future together, like they were in some kind of relationship, and like this was love. He told her he had big plans for her, and she was going to be his perfect Aryan companion, as he put it, and he'd try to fill her head with wild conspiracy theories. The older she got though, the more she resisted. Once, while he was beating her in retaliation, she punched herself in the face over and over again until he was the one who told her to stop. Another time she tried to cut her wrist with a knitting needle. Throughout her captivity as well, Natasha got brief glimpses of the outside world. Wolfgang had given her books and she read them all. He gave her a TV and a radio too, but she was only allowed to watch pre-recorded shows and listen to foreign radio stations, so she wouldn't hear about how hard people were trying to look for her. Because in a strange contrast, while her world was this little house, the rest of Austria was trying to find her. From the very beginning, her disappearance triggered one of the biggest missing persons investigations the country had ever seen. And as it turned out, there was a young witness to Nash's abduction in 1998 who clued police in to the white delivery van that sped off with her. In response, police hunted down and searched every van that matched the description, 776 of them to be exact, including Wolfgang's. Police actually had Wolfgang in his van right outside the house he was keeping Natasha in, and they let him go. Wolfgang told police that he was using the van to haul construction rubble from a home renovation. It wasn't much of an alibi, but he was quiet, polite, and lived in a respectable neighborhood, so they moved on. So with no other solid leads, the rumor mill churned, and the focus drifted from facts to speculation. And the whole time, Wolfgang was right there, shopping for groceries, taking out the trash, and going about his daily life like he had done nothing wrong. There's something especially cruel about how close people came to finding out soon after it happened. But thankfully, it would happen anyway, just after noon on August 23rd, 2006. Natasha was outside at the time vacuuming the very white van that had abducted her. By then, she was 18 years old, but Wolfgang remained nearby, as usual, watching and hovering over her. Then his phone rang and he stepped away to make a call just a short distance away, but far enough to disappear from view. The vacuum was also loud, drowning out all other noises. For the first time in 8 years, he let his guard slip just for a moment, and that moment was all she needed. Natasha didn't hesitate. She left the vacuum running to mask the silence. Then she sprinted over lawns, through hedges, and across streets. She jumped fences and pushed past bystanders who didn't realize what they were seeing. It wasn't until she reached the home of a 71-year-old woman that Natasha pounded on a window of the woman's house and repeated her full name over and over until the woman realized what was happening and phoned the police. Around 1:04 p.m., just minutes after Natasha made her escape, police arrived to take her away to a police station. She was pale, shaking, visibly underweight, and underdeveloped, but she was alive. 8 years earlier, when she was abducted by Wolfgang, she weighed about 90 pounds. At 18 years old, she was just 106 and had grown under 6 inches during her captivity. Almost immediately, police were able to confirm this was Natasha thanks to an identifying scar, and just like that, the manhunt began for her captor. Wolfgang, however, didn't go far. Once he realized he had let Natasha slip from his grasp, he knew it was over. Afterward, he drove to see his only real friend, a man named Ernst, and while the two drove around Vienna for 3 hours, Wolfgang confessed everything. He would go on to tell his friend every single last dark detail, and Ernst would later say he was trying to convince him to turn himself in, but Wolfgang was already gone in his mind. He made a promise years earlier to himself that he would never be taken alive. When Wolfgang finally decided the car ride with Ernst was over, he had his friend pull over and let him out. The two then said their goodbyes, and Ernst expected to see news of Wolfgang's arrest soon enough, but instead, he found some nearby train tracks and made his way down to them. He then lay on the ground, placing his head on the tracks themselves, and just waited. Moments later, a rumble started to grow more and more prominently. News of Natasha's escape quickly made it across Austria, and soon the world wanted to know more. She reluctantly agreed to speak to reporters who were taken aback by her poise and her outlook on the ordeal. Immediately, she made it clear that she wasn't going to answer questions about personal or intimate details of her captivity. She did admit to being assaulted by Wolfgang countless times, but despite everything she was put through, she harbored no ill will toward her captor. In fact, when she was told that Wolfgang was found dead, she apparently burst into tears. As horrifying as it all was, she spent 3,096 days with a man who was both a tormentor and the only other human presence in her world. Wolfgang had done horrific things to her, but he had also talked to her, cried in front of her, gave her books, took her skiing, and somewhere along the line she developed a level of care for him. At one point, after she turned 18 years old, she told Wolfgang that his dreams of a forever with her would never happen and he could no longer hold her down. After telling him this, she braced for what she was sure was going to be an attack, but instead, Wolfgang began sobbing, and the two actually cried together. In response to these stories, experts rushed to slap a label on her, alleging that Natasha was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. However, Natasha flat out rejected the notion, even to the point of taking offense to it. To her, the phrase reduced everything she had endured down to a single cliche, as if her experience could be encapsulated by a single word. She believed that when people said she was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, they were disrespecting her right to explain and define the complicated, painful relationship she had endured with her captor. In the years that followed her escape, Natasha wrote a memoir detailing her experience and even spent some time as a talk show host. One of the more controversial aspects of her after story is that she claimed ownership of the house where she had been kept against her will. She took it from Wolfgang's estate, and when people found out, they didn't know what to make of it. For Natasha, however, this was apparently about taking back control after having none for so long. She cleaned the house, went to visit it regularly, and she even had the cellar where she was kept filled in with concrete. According to sources, as of 2017, she's still listed as the house's owner. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.